It's the dictionary. Dictionary. It's the dictionary. Dictionary. It's the dictionary. Dictionary. It's the dictionary. It's the dictionary.
Hello, word nerds. Welcome to episode F25 of the podcast called The Dictionary, hosted by me, Spencer. That's me. Would you like to rate and review this show? Yes, you would. Go ahead and do that. It would make me feel so good. I love getting reviews. Don't get them very often. It makes my heart all fuzzy and fizzly. You can contact me. Email is dictionarypod@gmail.com. Google Voice number is 917-727-5757. I can't believe I actually remembered that after all these weeks since the last time I said it. Instagram, X, those are at dictionarypod if you want to follow me there. I really haven't been doing much. Well, I haven't been airing episodes. I should do more. I do have a TikTok. I don't do anything with it. I should do more. It's at Speejampar. That's my personal stuff. SPEJAMPAR, X, Instagram. I guess I'm on Threads too. What else? There is merchandise. There's a link in the show notes for merchandise. Buy a shirt. I've been pondering the idea of updating the logo. Have not had time to do that yet, but maybe someday there will be a new logo. I think that's good for now. Okay, this is going to be a fun episode, I think. The first word in this episode is fancy. Do you fancy some water? I have some water. I shall drink some water. This is the first form of the word fancy, F-A-N-C-Y. I'm so fancy. You already know. This is a transitive verb from the 14th century. Number 1, to have a fancy for, and the synonym is like. This use of this word, I have a fancy for that thing. I like that thing. It's weird to me. It's very old, I feel like. We still say it, right? Do you have a fancy for that thing? I have a fancy for water. I like water. It is the best liquid that we should be drinking. I have a fancy for lots of things. But the use of this is just so funny to me. Now, what would that be? Would that be the noun? You have a fancy for a thing? Is that a noun? I guess so. We'll get that in the next form. Okay, you got a fancy for a thing? You fancy it. I fancy you. You're so fancy. Okay, number 2 is to form a conception of, and the synonym is imagine. We have an example. Fancy our embarrassment. Can you even fancy our embarrassment when our pants fell down? What sort of embarrassment? We were so embarrassed. Can you just put yourself in that position? If your pants fell down, fancy that in your head. I don't feel like to form a conception of. I don't feel like this gets used very much. 3A, to believe mistakenly, or without evidence. You are believing something and there is no evidence for it. It is false. You are wrong. You're just wrong. So you are fancying it? It's kind of like the idea of bringing it up in your imagination, creating the concept of a thing, but there's no evidence for it. It's wrong. Oh, there are so many politicians on the right who are doing this sort of fancying. 3B, to believe without being certain. Similar idea, right? That's why it's 3B and not 3A and not 4. As in, she fancied she had met him before. I don't feel like I hear this very often at all. Not at all. To believe without being certain. I think maybe your face is looking kind of familiar. I fancy that we met before. But we haven't. Number 4 is to visualize or interpret as in, fancied myself a child again. This is an interesting example. To visualize, so you're just thinking about yourself as a child. Going back to those memory banks. Oh, yes, I'm fancying myself as a child wearing diapers. I don't have any memory of wearing diapers. There's video of me wearing diapers. That's embarrassing. But I don't have any specific memories of that. That's good. A synonym is the word think. That's all this is. Just thinking, making up things in your head. Now, so there's no etymology here. There is etymology in the next form of it. Was there any etymology fancy-wise in the previous episode? I don't think so. So I guess we're getting it all in the noun form, which is interesting. But I got to make a sound effect first. I have to go. The second form of fancy is a noun from, lots of etymology. From the 15th century. Number 1A, a liking formed by caprice rather than reason. The synonym is inclination. I have an inclination. We have an example. Look a fancy to the mutt. Okay, this is not at all. My brain has no experience with this form at all. Look a fancy to the mutt. Huh? So you have a liking formed by caprice rather than reason. And I need a reminder of what caprice is. Is it the car? Is it something else? How did I get through all of these? We're on page 452. Where did all these pages go? How did I get through all of those things? Oh, it's because you've been doing this for years. Caprice is a sudden, impulsive, and seemingly unmotivated notion or action. It's just like, I'm going to do this thing right now. I'm going to go buy those Oreos because they're right at the counter and I want them tasty Oreos. Okay, so that's impulsive. Yep, that's a good way to think about that. So fancy, noun, a liking formed by caprice. I like the thing. There's no reason to like the thing. I have no reason to like this mutt. But because it is a dog, I am impulsive when it comes to dogs. My wife more so, but we are both very like, oh, dogs. So I I think it says, I may have said look. It's took a fancy to the mutt. Now that makes more sense. Not look a fancy. Took a fancy. Yes. Okay. Making more sense, Spencer. Good job. Yes, I have an inclination to any dog. I have a fancy to the dogs. So yes, this is the one that I was talking about before. The idea of just liking a thing. Now, we got to move on because I have a couple more thoughts. Maybe you just one thought. But let's go to 1B, amorous fondness, and the synonym is love. So in the first definition, you're liking a thing just like, oh, it's so great, I like that thing, I took a fancy to it real quick. No reason, this is just how I feel. But then the next one is, we went all the way to the love level. I fancy that so much. I fancy so many things. Don't you fancy things? Tell me what you fancy. Would you like to tell me what you fancy? If this were alive, you could start typing those things in. But you can't do that right now. You can email me. You can DM me. You can do all those things. Leave a message. Tell me what you fancy. Okay. So that was what I was going to comment on. This was like, the first one was the impulsive fondness. But then we got the other one, which is you love a thing. What am I fancying right now? I am fancying. We're watching lots of movies. You know, we try and watch movies. I fancy movies. The fancier the movie, the better. Not necessarily, actually. Okay, now we have number 2A. The synonyms are notion and whim. Notion and whim. I have a notion. I have a whim. It's like a thought. It's like I'm going to do this thing, maybe impulsively. I'm going to fancy a coffee real quick. I don't know. 2B. An image or representation of something formed in the mind. The etymology has got to say something about the brain, the thoughts, the mind, all those things. Because there's been so many things like that. So, an image or representation of something formed in the mind, very specifically. So if you just think of anything, what are we thinking of? We're thinking of a green bubbly dragon. Then I'm fancying a dragon. I love that dragon so much. Number 3 is archaic, and it is fantastic quality or state. I wonder if the word fantastic is related to fancy. Are they distant cousins? Fantastic quality or state. If something is great in that state, then it's fancy. Now, that doesn't seem that archaic, but maybe we got more that's going to get more specific into this fancy world. 4A, imagination, especially of a capricious or delusive sort. Ooh, so capricious, that's related to caprice that we saw before, and that's all about being impulsive. So imagination in an impulsive way or delusive, like, oh, that's not very smart, or you're doing that for the wrong reasons. You're delusional if you are imagining that. I don't know. This one is fancy. I want to know how to use this in a sentence, please. 4B, the power of conception and representation used in artistic expression. And this is as by a poet. A poet. Now, how is a poet using this? The power of conception and representation used in artistic expression. It's the power. So how would you use that one in a sentence? The poet fancies words. The poet is using words in an artistic way, and so that's a fancy poet. The poet is fancy. Is the poem fancy? I'm not sure how exactly to use this one. Number 5, synonyms are taste and judgment. You know, not the tongue taste, but the more metaphorical taste. You got good taste in clothes, good taste in movies, because you're very judgmental. Fancy. I don't know how to use all of these in the sense. Most of these are like, do people even use this word in this way? I don't think so. 6A, devotees of some particular art, practice, or amusement. If you are devoted to something, like let's say I am a devotee of the amusement and entertainment of movies, then I would be a fancy? I think that's what it's saying. A devotees of some particular art practice. You are a fancy. Now there's fan, and that's short. Now the fan is short for fanatic. Oh, I don't know. I get okay. Sure, we're all fancies. If you are a devotee of something, you are a fancy. 6B, the object of interest of such a fancy. So if you love a thing, you have a fancy for it, and you are the fancy who is fancying the fancy. The fancy, the fancy. That's a sentence. That's perfectly fine. I didn't know that. It says especially the synonym would be the first form of the word boxing. Why would they put boxing here? Do people often say boxing is my fancy? I really want to now see some fancy boxing though. Don't you think? Why aren't there people boxing in gowns, tuxes, top hats, heels, sparkly things, anything else that's fancy? I think that we need boxing like that. Okay, can you please make that happen? Thank you. Yeah, the fancy, the fancy. That's a good sentence. I like that. Okay, now we have the etymology. The wonderful etymology. This is from, Middle English, fantasy, or fancy with a T, Fantsy, which means, you probably see where this is going already, imagination, image, illusion, and preference. We have fantasy stories, novels, movies, and that's all from your imagination. Use your imagination. And then it became fancy. It got shortened. From Anglo-French, fantasy, which means illusion. From Latin, fantasia, with a PH, fantasia. Also from Greek, maybe it's the same word, fantasia, which means appearance, and also imagination. And from phantazine, this is Greek, phantazine, which means to present to the mind. Ooh, that's a thinker. It's like, what is presenting something to the mind? Is it not the mind that is making up the thought? Is there something else that is presenting the idea to the mind? Is that what the Greeks thought? Ooh, this is fascinating. That one says middle voice to imagine, just to imagine, okay. From pheinin, which means to show. So it's like the idea of it's being shown to the mind. And that's your imagination. Your imagination is something being shown to you. So it's not like an active thing that you are doing. It's something else that is being shown to you. Oh, this is a very interesting and deep thought when you really think about it that way. It's like, whoa, what is it? Is my mind making up the thoughts, or is something else making up the thoughts? Showing them to me? Sometimes it feels like that, right? It's like, I don't know where that thought came from. It just popped in my head. Okay, pheinin, to show, which is akin to the Old English geboned. Oh, what is this word? Geboned, and that means polished. No clue how that's related. Also from the Greek phos with a ph, which means light. Okay. That was a lot of stuff. I had so many things to say for all this stuff, but there was, it's fancy. Fancy is fancy, but we got more fancy. The third form of fancy is an adjective from 1646. Number 1, dependent or based on fancy, and the synonym is whimsical. Whimsical. It's dependent or based on fancy. I feel like my brain does not, it's like these words don't mean anything. Some of these definitions, because they're not so literal, and I'm a very literal person, I think that's the slightly autistic part of me, that these definitions that are not so literal and specific, I'm like, I don't get those words. Maybe there should be a dictionary for people on the autism spectrum. But how do you describe some of these concepts? That's the thing. I don't know. Okay, whimsical. Whimsical, dependent or based on fancy. Number 2A1. Not plain. Not plain. I think I'm pretty plain. So it's kind of fun when you get to be not plain, dress up not plain. I think I need to dress better, though. I think that would be good for me. The synonym is ornamental, as in a fancy hairdo. A fancy hairdo. My hair is not quite long enough to do a fancy hairdo. I debate with myself weekly. Should I grow my hair out big? I got lots of fancy hair. Should I grow it out? Or should I keep it like this? Or, I mean, it's very messy right now, but it's fun to have it be messy. Let's make it messier. Let's do one of these twisty things that we do sometimes and make it look very silly. That's the fanciest. Nah, it didn't work. Okay, number 2A2. The synonyms are the second definition for the word swanky and also the word posh. Posh, yes, these are all words I think of when I think of fancy. Not so much whimsical. Swanky, posh, as in a fancy restaurant. This is a restaurant you probably got to dress up for. It maybe even it's one of those where they're like, you need a tie. We have a couple extra ties, but you really should have brought your own tie. I don't go to restaurants like these. A tie, a jacket. Why would I want to go to a place like that? That is not me. That is not how I dress normally. I don't mind on occasion, but typically, as you can see, I'm not a jacket and tie kind of person. And it's going to be more expensive. This is a celebration. This is a once a year kind of thing. That fancy restaurant. 2B1, of particular excellence or highest grade, as in fancy tuna. The tuna is of very high quality, and it's excellent, and so it's fancy tuna. It seems like an odd example, but I don't know. Are people calling tuna fancy? Maybe. Maybe you get the fancy tuna at the fancy restaurant. I fancy some tuna. Because I am a fancier of the tuna. I'm not me. I don't eat the tuna. I'll eat some fake tuna, though. 2B1. No, we did that one. 2B2. The synonym is impressive, as in posted some fancy numbers. Ooh, those numbers. Wow, I am so impressed with those numbers. They were able to run a 4-minute marathon, 4-minute mile. Good job, numbers. Those are fancy numbers. 2C. This is talking about an animal or a plant, and it is bred especially for bizarre or ornamental qualities that lack practical utility. So really, these plants or animals, I do not like the idea of breeding animals in general, especially not for visual, bizarre, ornamental qualities opposed to practical utility. So like those cats that have the short little stubby legs, point number one, they are the cutest goddamn things ever, but also people bred them to be that way, I believe. I don't think that they are a naturally occurring thing other than with, like, genetic mutations. But plants, people are breeding plants like, ooh, this is a unique thing. Let's make that happen again. Ooh, it's getting crazier. Let's keep on going. How crazy, how fancy can we make these plants? There's no use for them. They have no practical utility, so they're fancy. Number 3, based on conceptions of the fancy, as in fancy sketches. Fancy sketches are based on conceptions of the fancy. So like here, of the fancy, does that mean like of the mind, the imagination? You have a thing in your mind, something has shown you this image in your brain, into your mind, and then you sketch it out. So that would be a fancy sketch. Now, I wouldn't understand fancy sketches when somebody said that. A fancy sketch to me is like using calligraphy, using those fancy quill pens, maybe glitter, maybe fancy ornamentation, swirlies and plants. I don't know. Not just something from the mind. Number 4A, dealing in fancy goods. What? 4B, synonym is extravagant, as in paying fancy prices. Yeah, just a lot of stuff, a lot of money, fancy prices for the fancy tuna at the fancy restaurant. Yes, you will pay those extravagant fancy prices there. 5. Oh, somebody was just telling us that they went to one of these extremely fancy restaurants, but they knew the chef. They know the chef, and so I think it was all on the house, maybe? Because he's like giving him music lessons? I don't know. That's like, it was beyond a price that I could comprehend for a meal. It like none of the people I know would ever go to a place like that and pay for it. Number 5, executed with technical skill and style, as in fancy footwork. Fancy footwork, also as in fancy diving. Those Olympic divers and the other people who are not in the Olympics who are doing competitive diving, they are doing the very fancy diving. Technical skill and style. You need to know how to do the thing very well, how to do the flippies and the floppies and do the twisties and the turnies and land in the pool the correct way and not belly flop. But you also must do it with style. How do you do it with style? That is the question that I ask myself every morning. Number 6, the synonym is party color? Parti-color, I guess, as in fancy carnations. I would guess that these are carnations, things that have multicolors, but it says party color. I don't know what party color is. Fancily is an adverb and fanciness is a noun. I don't have a lot of fanciness. As I said, it is fun to get fancy sometimes, but in general, I am not a fancy person, which I am okay with, and I hope you are too. And I mentioned it before, sort of, but there's that song, and I don't really know it all that well, but I'm I'm so fancy. You already know. Boop, boop, doop, boo, boo. Boo-ba-doo, boo-ba-doo, ba-doo, Idaho. Is that where it goes? I don't think so. Next is Fancy Dan. 2 words with a hyphen adjective. The D is often capitalized, not all the time. You don't have to capitalize it if you don't want to, but you can if you do. This is from 1938. The synonyms are the number 2 definition for the word showy and also the word fancy, as in Fancy Dan basketball players hot dogging on the court. Well, I think the Harlem Globetrotters can 100% be called Fancy Dan basketball players, because this is the adjective, but we got more. Fancy Dan, 2 words with a capital D, noun, and the F in this context is often capitalized. Oh, great. This is from circa 1943, so this is interesting because Fancy Dan adjective came from 1938, but Fancy Dan was 5 years later? It seems like it would have been the other way around. A Fancy Dan is one given to flamboyant display, especially of technique or dress. The peacock, that's another one. That's a Fancy Dan. Oh, I hope that peacock is named Dan because they're a Fancy Dan. But going back to the Harlem Globetrotters, I've never seen them in person. That would be a lot of fun. I've seen many clips over the years. They have been doing this fancy footwork, fancy ball work, fancy passing for all these years. And they are absolutely Fancy Dans, being Fancy Dan basketball players. But I don't think there's any etymology. And I'm still blown away by Fancy Dan adjective coming first, and then Fancy Dan coming later. This is an interesting one. But well, yeah, Fancy Dan basketball players. Fancy Dan basketball players. That didn't go great. Next is fancy dress, 2 words, noun from 1770. A costume, as for a masquerade, chosen to suit the wearer's fancy. The wearer's fancy that's just like what the wearer wants to wear, right? What they like, what they love. Chosen, I don't really understand that last part. Chosen to suit the wearer's fancy. Well, yeah, obviously they fancy it. They wouldn't wear it if they didn't fancy it. It's just a costume. It's the dress that you put on when you want to go to a masquerade. Next is fancy free, 2 words with a hyphen, adjective from 1590. Number 1, free from amorous attachment or engagement. As in the phrase, we all know this phrase, footloose and fancy free. Oh, I am free to be fancy. I am free to find the things that I fancy. Is that why we have the word fancy in there? You do not have the amorous, the love attachment, so you can go out and find other amorous attachments. No engagements. You are free, or you are free from your fancy? The thing that you loved? Or are you free to find another fancy? I don't know, whichever way you like is fine with me. Number 2, free to imagine or fancy. I would like to think that we are all fancy-free in that way, free to just think of whatever you want to think of. Please, when they start locking down your brain, your mind, your imagination, then we got some problems. Next is fancy man, 2 words, noun from circa 1811. A woman's paramour, and also the synonym pimp, P-I-M-P, pimp. I don't remember what the word paramour means. I think that we can gather enough information from that synonym to figure out pretty much what it is, but I would like to have a little bit more context. Paramour, I'm skipping ahead because I want to. Ooh, it's an illicit lover. Ooh, we are not supposed to be loving. I'm not supposed to fancy you, so you are my paramour. So a fancy man is the one. Now, of course, we have to call out that these are genderized. This is a genderized situation we got here. But it's from 1811, so things were a little bit different back then. In certain ways, similar in some ways, whatever. Anyway, so the fancy man is either the pimp or the illicit lover of a woman. And I think that, if we want to adjust this for modern times and get rid of the genderized things and words, anybody can be a fancy man as long as they must be an illicit lover. That is the most important part, or the pimp, I guess. Okay, and if there are any children listening and you don't know what a pimp is, just ask your parents and have that uncomfortable conversation with them. Next is fancy pants. 2 words with a hyphen. Isn't there a Pink song? She talks about getting dancy. Is fancy in there too? I can't remember, but that's one of my favorite lines. She's like, it's about getting dancy, but I thought maybe fancy was in there. Okay, fancy pants, adjective from 1945. This is overly elegant or refined. And the synonym is la-di-da. I didn't expect that to be in the dictionary. La-di-da. So fancy. Your pants are so fancy. Overly elegant or refined. Why does it have to be overly? Why can't it just be extremely elegant or refined? Overly is a judgment. You're saying that you were too fancy if you're fancy pants. Okay, yeah, there's probably often that connotation when you call somebody a fancy pants or describe them as fancy pants, but yeah, okay, I don't know. It is kind of a judgmental term. That is true. Usually you use it that way. Fancy, but now I want some fancy pants. Some fancy pants. I don't know what those fancy pants look like, but I should have some fancy pants. Fancy up. 2 words. Transitive verb from 1934. To add superficial or adornment to. To add superficial adornment to. Superficial is like, it is unnecessary. You don't need it there. This adornments, no. You have fancied it up too much. Can maybe fancy it down. Fancy down. Can that be a term? Fancy woman. Based on fancy man, maybe you can tell where this is going. Noun from 1812, and real quick, let's look at fancy man. That was 1811, and fancy woman was 1812. That's really close. Those words are usually much farther apart. So, a fancy woman. Of course, it's a different sort of similar but different from fancy man. A woman of questionable morals. There wasn't anything mentioned about questionable morals with the fancy man. They just got to love on the side. So you can see the problem that there is in society, in culture, at least in certain parts of the world, with men versus women. Why do we do this? I hope we're getting better. Specifically, though, there is the synonym prostitute. The fancy man is a pimp. The fancy woman is a prostitute. It is kind of interesting that they use fancy for these people, because that makes them sound, fancy, expensive, out on the it's an interesting use of words, I think. Fancy work, 1 word, noun from 1791. Decorative needlework. I don't know, maybe I'll just put a picture on the social media of fancy work, which is needlework that's very decorative. Okay, more. F and A. Capital F, the word and capital A. Abbreviation for fore and aft. That's what it stands for. Fore is F-O-R-E. So this is like the front of the ship and the back of the ship. The fore, the front, the aft, the back. I believe I have that correctly. If I don't, please politely let me know. So are sailors, boat people saying F and A? I don't know. Fandango. Did not expect this to be in the dictionary. Or you can probably say Fandango, but it does not put that in the pronunciation. It just says Fandango? I don't know. Whatever you want to say is probably fine. Noun from 1770. There's a wild fandango loose in the theater. Rah. Okay, number 1. A lively Spanish or Spanish-American dance in triple time that is usually performed by a man and a woman to the accompaniment of guitar and castanets. Also, music for this dance is fandango. And I did not know that this was music and dance. I don't think I knew that. I knew it as there's the company that we all are probably aware of when you go buy movie tickets, getting movie information. It's like the hub of movie stuff, Fandango. And that, of course, is where the wild fandango loose in the theater came from. Oh, and then back in the day, they had those paper puppet things. That was funny. Okay, so, but really, it's a dance. And now I feel like I should look at some of this dancing. Can we do that real quick? Let's see. We might have to cut part of this out, but we'll see. Fandango dance. Oh, spelled that wrong. Let's see. We got lots of different kinds. Maybe this is a good one. Let's do this one. Somebody lost their hat. There's 7 women and 1 man. I don't understand why. I mean, whatever, it's fine. Usually they're even numbers. Oh, yes. They got hats, they got fancy dresses, and castanets. That looks very fun. Okay, that's the Fandango dance. And we shall minimize that. Now, but we have number 2 for Fandango. The synonym is tomfoolery. How did we go from a dance and music to tomfoolery? Where did that happen? Why did people start saying Fandango is tomfoolery? Oh, this podcast is such Fandango. Interesting. Now, it says it's a Spanish word. But it doesn't say what exactly it means, but I guess maybe they just made up their word for their dance and music. And maybe that's all it is. And then also tomfoolery. Fandom. Noun from 1903. That is another one of the, like fanboy. That's one of those words that I did not expect to see such an early year. Number 1. All the fans. And we're talking about maybe like a sport. All of the fans of the sport of Irish hurling are the fandom. Like in Barbie, he had the kendom. It's all the Kens. Number 2 for fandom is the state or attitude of being a fan. If you are a fan, you are in a state of fandom. Fandom. Fane, F-A-N-E, noun from the 15th century. Number 1, the synonym is temple. And number 2, the synonym is church. Doesn't say much in the etymology, but it does say there's more at feast. And so, temples, churches, people, the community coming together, the fandom. If you are a fan of your god, and then you would be part of that fandom, that religious fandom. I think we should start calling religious things fandoms. Feast. Okay, one more word. Yay! It's fanfare. 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 Noun from 1605. Number 1, a short and lively sounding of trumpets. Number 2, a showy outward display, like the peacock, like the Harlem Globetrotter. Why do those go together so well? Like peanut butter and jelly, globetrotters and peacocks. Showy, an outward showy display is the fanfare that you are putting out to the world. Okay, let's pick a word of the episode. We had some good ones. Today we had fancy, fancy, fancy. Fancy Dan, fancy Dan. Fancy dress, fancy free. Fancy man, fancy pants. Fancy up, fancy woman. Fancy work, F&A. Fandango, fandom, fane, and fanfare. Whew. I mean, fancy is a good one to pick. There's a lot of stuff going on with the word fancy. I kind of like, I don't know, fancy pants is pretty good. Even though it's a little bit judgmental, it's kind of like, yeah, whatever. I'm gonna be a fancy pants. You can't help it. So fancy pants. I am not a fancy pants person though. Whatever. Let's pick fancy pants. This is 2 words with a hyphen. Fancy pants is the word of the episode. Walking down the street in my fancy pants. My brain shut down. Walking down the street in my fancy pants. I don't care what people think when I'm in my fancy pants. All right, fantastic. Fancy-tastic. Let's see. I am going to now tell you about a movie that I watched because I fancy movies. And I fancy UVs. Okay, load faster, please. Where did we leave off? I believe we watched Babes. That was the last one. And then we watched the movie Trap. This is a fun movie by the Shyamalan man. About... you know in the preview, it's about a serial killer who is at a concert, and they have the cops have developed this trap to trap him, and he's so wily. He is a wily man. So yeah, Trap. It was fun. I enjoyed it. I think maybe it's getting mixed reviews, like all of Shyamalan's movies. They all have very mixed reviews, so you can't please everybody. All right, I think that is the end of the episode. It's a long one, lots of fancy stuff to say today. And until next time, this is Spencer dispensing information. Goodbye.